So thanks everyone for joining the session about increasing student engagement with social annotation. My name is Christie DeCarolis. I am the Customer Success Manager for Hypothesis, serving Rutgers. So anyone that has any questions about Hypothesis or needs training in Hypothesis, I'm always happy to be here to answer questions or walk you through setting it up in your courses. I am going to start out just by reviewing kind of what Hypothesis is, and then we'll move to the panel and talk about how our 3 faculty members at Rutgers have used it in their courses. It looks like, according to the poll, that the majority of you here have not used Hypothesis and you're not sure what it is. So I think this will be a good way to kind of provide a little bit of context and when everyone's talking about how they're using it in your courses, you have an image in your mind of what exactly that means. So I will share my screen here. All right, so just to get started, our faculty members that are joining us today are all Rutgers faculty members. Lisa Payne, Assistant Professor of Psychology from Rutgers Camden. Ryan Rhodes, Assistant Teaching Professor at the Rutgers Center for Cognitive Science. And Jamie Pietruska, Associate Professor of History at Rutgers. So thanks all for the panelists who are willing to spend their time talking about Hypothesis in their courses today. But first, like I said, I just want to start out by talking about what exactly Hypothesis is and what it looks like to annotate with Hypothesis. Hypothesis is a social annotation tool, and a lot of people come to me and they're like, Christy, I don't like social annotation. What does that mean? Basically, it allows us to take a sidebar and put it over the text of our reading in Canvas, and it gives space for students to add annotation in a collaborative way. So if I open my Canvas course here and open a reading in Canvas, basically what Hypothesis lets me do is it adds this sidebar on the right-hand side of the course here. So I have my reading loaded into the left-hand side of the course as you normally would. You're assigning students reading, they're pulling it up from Canvas. The big difference here is that I have now placed this discussion area that coincides with the reading itself. So Hypothesis lets the students scroll through the reading, select specific text that they'd like to make a comment about, and when they select that text, they can then type in their thoughts on the right-hand side of the window. So in this particular annotation that Jennifer has made on the right, I can see here that this text is the text that's turning green on the left-hand side of the screen. That's the text she's chosen to annotate. So the annotations are really deeply anchored to the text itself. I can see exactly which phrase or sentence a student is talking about, and then the student has asked a question here. As I continue to scroll down, I can see other places where students have added annotations. You might have also noticed that some of the annotations have the space to show replies. And the show replies button, if I click on that, it expands and it can show a conversation that has started around that particular annotation. So annotations in a text in Canvas can be attached to the text itself, or they can be attached to other annotations. So it's almost like the students are having a threaded discussion around the text right on top of the text. So students can really specifically talk about this one piece of text without having to go back to it, without having to just kind of remember what it was talking about. They're having these conversations around very precise areas of text. As I scroll through, say I'm a student and I wanted to add an annotation, all I would have to do is select the text that I'd like to annotate. click the annotate button, and then I can add an annotation to the right-hand side here. And I can click post. So my annotation's been added right as I'm reading about this piece of text, and I don't have to go anywhere else. I can just continue on moving. So the power of annotation here really is that the students can kind of think about what they're thinking about the text, participate in some metacognition and type those thoughts as they're reading, those questions as they're reading. They don't have to kind of collect their thoughts as they go and then go to a separate space, an essay or a discussion board to compile their thoughts at that point. Another kind of good benefit that I'll just briefly bring up when it comes to social annotation is that sometimes students can be a little bit limited by text alone. So in this instance, Jennifer is trying to paraphrase the law of conservation of momentum, because honestly, in my own opinion, this textbook has not done a really good job of defining the law of conservation of momentum. So she's saying, is this what this means? This is what I think it means. And another student can come in and say, yes, and I found this video that really helps me understand it. So in this example, Malika embedded a YouTube video that demonstrates the law of conservation of momentum, and it really broadened the scope of the text and how students can understand the concepts in the text by bringing in these multimedia images, videos, other things that can really help them understand what they're reading. So here at Hypothesis, we like to say that it makes reading more active, visible, and social. It makes reading more active because it's asking to students to think about what they're reading as they're doing so, and then actually write those thoughts down in a way that the whole class can see. So again, we're encouraging that metacognition, that deeper reading that they might not be doing otherwise. It makes reading visible in that you as the instructor can now see where are students struggling, what parts of the text do they have questions about, what parts of the text are they avoiding, do they not make comments on, and what are they really connecting with. And it makes reading social, since students are participating in this social or collaborative annotation. They're all doing the reading together, and their classmates and their instructors' annotations can help them better understand what the text is saying, or perhaps open new perspectives about what the text is saying. So that is my kind of quick rundown of what has been, what Hypothesis is and what Hypothesis can enable us to do. But really, the point of the session today is to talk to 3 Rutgers faculty who have been using Hypothesis in their courses and really how it's worked for them. So I'm going to stop screen sharing at this point and turn it over to our faculty so we can start our conversation. And if anyone has any kind of basic Hypothesis questions, feel free to throw them in the chat so I can address them. All right, so thanks, Ryan, Jamie, and Eric. Were we able to get pull Lisa in here?
Still working on that.
Okay. All right, we'll start with Ryan and Jamie, and then we can pull Lisa in if we can. So the first thing I'll ask is just to give a brief introduction. What is your role? And then what kinds of classes are you teaching? And by kinds of classes, I mean subject, face-to-face or online. Do they tend to be undergrad, grad? Are they large, small? Lots of different features to consider. Jamie, can we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Christie. Hi, everyone. I'm an associate professor in the history department in New Brunswick, and I teach primarily undergraduate history courses in STEM-related topics. So I teach a course on the social history of data, accidents and disasters, technology and nature, and American history, and history of the future. These are 3 of them are 200 level courses. One is a 300 level writing intensive course. But my goal in all of these is to try to reach students across the disciplines and bridge the humanities and the STEM fields. I've taught online since the start of the pandemic, and now this semester I'm teaching 1 course in person. So I've mostly done large online courses, and Hypothesis has been really helpful in that regard.
Great. And Ryan, do you mind just answering the same kind of brief intro about what you teach?
Yeah, I'm assistant teaching professor for the Center for Cognitive Science. So I teach the big. We only really do undergrad courses, and my main teaching responsibility is teaching the big introductory undergraduate course for the new majors for the freshmen on Introduction to Cognitive Science. But I also teach a couple other courses that I've designed about language, and about neuroscience. So I do a class on neurolinguistics. I'm doing a class now on language and cognition, and those are, again, it's undergraduate, but it's higher level. And it's intended for students who are like a really broad cross-section, because the cognitive science major is really interdisciplinary. So I think Hypothesis is really useful for this. We have students who have really, really different backgrounds, and they have to engage with really high-level, difficult texts from these fields that they may not be familiar with. So that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves in.
Great. And I think actually, both of you mentioned something that's relevant to a question that came up in the chat. Michelle asked that, she said, Hypothesis could be good in a small class, but how would you use it in a large medical school class of more than 150 students? So it sounds like both of you teach rather large classes. How have you managed to incorporate the social annotation with having a larger class size? Ryan, do you mind starting?
I really only use Hypothesis in my smaller classes, but my smaller classes are still up to 100 students. And in those cases, I think Hypothesis is actually probably it's especially useful, I think, when you have a lot of students, because it's really hard. When you have really big class, it's really hard for students to voice in class, say like, oh, I don't understand something, and can you stop? Like, people don't want to take class time. And the larger the class is, I think the more reticent people are to ask questions during class. So if you have something like Hypothesis, sometimes they wind up answering each other's questions, which is really nice. And then you can sort of supervise. You can look at the comments in Hypothesis, and you can pick like, okay, here's some really important areas that maybe I need to go over in class and talk about, because lots of people are kind of confused or lost about a certain thing. So I think Hypothesis actually works really well when you have a lot of students.
Oh, that's great. Jamie, do you have any other thoughts to add about that?
Sure. I would echo Ryan's sense that this is especially useful for large courses. And I use Hypothesis, the function that allows you to assign students into groups. So for my online courses, Hypothesis groups correlate to their Canvas discussion groups. So they already know the people that they're responding to on the annotation platform. And right now I'm teaching a course in person, which has recitation sections and teaching assistants. And so we use Hypothesis to annotate a particular reading before our recitation section meets. And so we do that again by section, and it's a great way to get the conversation started in the margins so that everyone has something to say when they come to class.
That's a great segue into something else I was hoping to ask. I've heard from some faculty that Hypothesis using the social annotation tool will kind of make their in-class discussions more active. Do you find that has been your experience, Jamie? Has the nature of your discussions in class changed since you started using the tool?
I would say it's definitely the case that it helps jumpstart discussion, especially among those students who might otherwise, be more reticent or, reluctant to speak in front of the group. And so part of what I've tried to do is to also read the annotations myself before I give a lecture or before I teach a recitation section, so that I can say, as Amelia mentioned in hypothesis, or, ask Lucas to say a little bit more about what he said in the margins. And so it's, I think, a good way to weave in students' ideas. And so I think it makes the conversation feel more organic. And it also, I think, provides an opportunity for students to, contribute in a way that they might not otherwise have done. So I think it's a really important sort of connective tissue between, the practice of social annotation and then having that real-time conversation.
Oh yeah, that's great. I feel like it's kind of takes away like the harshness of the cold call. You're like not really cold calling students because they've gotten their thoughts down a little bit in the annotations. Ryan, have you had similar experiences in your own class? Do you bring those annotations into in-class discussions?
Yeah, 100%. So I think everything Jamie said, 100% true, right? So, students, there's a much lower bar when you're writing a comment online, directly onto the text versus, speaking in class in front of everyone. And so we read the annotations before we go to class. I think that's the best way to use hypothesis. That's like one of its most useful functions. You read people's comments before you go to class, and then during class you can say, oh, someone mentioned something really interesting. In the classes that I teach, sometimes students will pitch experiment ideas. We're reading experimental papers and they say, oh, what would be a really interesting thing is if they tested this, and be like, that's a really great idea. I don't think anyone's done that. And I can bring that up in class. And that's the thing that, if you didn't have this, if people didn't write these comments down ahead of time, you might never hear that from someone in class. And it's stuff that only comes out because they get to write it ahead of time. They have time to think about it. They're not under any pressure. They're not under any real social pressure, right? Not talking in front of a group. And so it's like really useful for that.
Yeah, I think the extra processing time sometimes that students get in order to kind of create their annotations can be really helpful. I'm one of the students that like I never feel like when professors call out in class, ask a question, it always takes me, I'm like ready to answer 10 minutes later. We've moved on by then. But hypothesis lets you have that processing time before you're actually going into the class discussion. Oh, Lisa, have you made it?
I think so. Can we hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Oh,
Yes,
thanks
wonderful.
for your
Thank
patience
you.
in
Yes,
trying to
thank you,
get
Eric.
in. So we basically have just talked about, providing some quick intros. Do you mind us sharing what kinds of classes you teach? Like how big they are? Is it grad, undergrad? A quick rundown of how you use hypothesis in your classes?
Yeah, absolutely. As of now, for the last couple of years, I have been using hypothesis for my graduate level courses. They have lots of empirical journal article reading to do weekly. And this started during remote teaching as a way to get conversations started. And then I just enjoyed it so much, and I thought the students did as well. And they reported that on course evaluations that they thought it contributed to their learning. Highly agree, strongly agree. So I have kept that, and it's still one of my favorite parts of the course is reading the student annotations. They come out of their shells in a way that they don't always do in the classroom. And then I can see where are the misconceptions, where's the confusions, what they're interested in, what we should talk about more. And then I take that into the classroom. So far it has worked excellent with classes of, anywhere from 10 to 30 for my graduate level classes.
Awesome. We have a lot of questions in the chat coming in about like a little bit more specifics about how you all are setting up your assignments and getting students to participate in the assignments. So Amy asked, what instructions do you give your students prior to assigning social annotation assignments? And do you rely on videos or text-based instructions? And then what are your expectations of students in terms of what you want them to write? So I guess in a kind of broader sense, how are you guiding students to annotate? Are you expecting specific kinds of annotations? Like what kind of requirements are you giving in these assignments? Jamie, could you start us off with this one?
Sure. So I really try to mix it up in terms of how I structure my hypothesis assignments. Sometimes it is open-ended, and so I'll just ask students to annotate, write 5 or 6 sentences about some aspect of the reading that they found particularly significant or surprising. Other times it will be much more structured. So they might be asked to connect a particular passage from the reading to a concept from the lecture. Sometimes I will go in and post reading questions throughout the reading, and then students will work with 1 or 2 other classmates to answer the questions. Sometimes they'll compare readings to another source. Sometimes they'll respond, to 2 or 3 different classmates. Sometimes they'll annotate reading in preparation for a formal paper assignment. I'm a historian, so I shared with students a source I found in the archives, and so students annotated it by posting questions that they would need to be able to answer in order to interpret and contextualize the source. So I try to just always mix it up and try to make things as varied as possible.
Cool. That sounds good that you're kind of switching it up and keeping it varied for the students. Lisa, what about you? How do you tend to guide the students and setting up the social annotation assignments?
So at the very beginning of the semester, I post one of the modules in my Canvas website is always course essentials. And in there's just a brief video on how to use Hypothesis. And then I have just a document of the requirements. So their annotations are typically 30% of their course grade, and there are several each week. And in the guide for the annotations, I keep it pretty broad and I give a few examples. So I say they must comment at least twice, throughout the paper. It can be a question about information in there. It can be an I wonder, it can be a response to another student's question. When I see that certain parts of the papers are being ignored, like methods, I've started putting in, a question that I ask in the methods, how could this have changed the results, that type of thing, to try and generate those responses. So I leave it to the students, and I've kind of had in the back of my mind, okay, if they stop responding in a highly qualitative way, then I would introduce more specific guidelines, and I have not had to. I look through, and they have the way Hypothesis works is, when I go through what they call speed grader, on Canvas, it loads it up and it actually makes conversations. So I can see a whole thread of students responding to each other and talking to each other, as well as their individual, comments, and it'll highlight the part of the article they're responding to. And then I can just drop down and see what they're responding to. So I haven't had to give them more guidance than that. And then, just that little nudge towards don't ignore, this section.
All right, so it sounds like Lisa's keeping it pretty consistent. Jamie might switch up the instructions a little bit here and there. Ryan, how do you tend to guide the students with the annotations? Are they kind of doing the same things with each reading, or do you give them different assignments depending on what they're working on?
I do almost exactly the same thing that Lisa described, where I'll give them a few examples of here are some contributions that I would make. You can ask questions. You can help other students. Sometimes a paper doesn't define some of the terms, and so maybe you go look outside the reading and you say, oh, what does this mean? And you add definitions as an annotation, something like that. But I keep it really open-ended. Just make some kind of contribution that you think would be valuable to another person taking this class. So I try to push like the social element of it, that you are supposed to be talking to each other and helping each other.
Yeah, that's great. And I didn't mention this in the beginning, but I also use Hypothesis in my own courses. And I usually start out my students with us annotating the syllabus as a kind of nudge that, like, look, we are going to participate together in this class in every document. So you might as well get used to it now. I need you to be actively engaged in everything that we're doing with the annotations. So that's good. I'm just trying to scroll through the chat to see if there are any other questions that came up here. Otherwise, we talked about kind of like your setup a little bit and how you have all decided to implement social annotation with Hypothesis in your courses. Have you kind of learned anything along the way? Are there any best practices or tips you might give to faculty who are interested in starting to use Hypothesis? And I'll see if is there any volunteers for taking that one first, so I don't put people on the spot.
I'll go.
Okay, Jamie.
Yeah, I forgot to say that I use the syllabus annotation assignment, and I think I was initially skeptical when I heard about it, and I thought, oh, is there any sort of value to this beyond just learning the Hypothesis platform? But I have just been so blown away by the thoughtful questions about the course material that students post in the margins. And so some students are interested in, clarifying some aspect of the course policies, but it's such a terrific way to start the course, especially for large online courses, because it allows me to connect individually with each student in my response, but also to really get a sense of what they're most interested in. So I'm a big believer in annotating the syllabus, and we did it, in fact, in my in-person course this semester, I think to great effect. I think I've been really surprised by just how detailed and how thoughtful some of the responses are in my upper level writing intensive course. I mean, I had students writing what were really full-fledged essays in the margins, with a main argument, with a kind of structure, with evidence. And so it was very easy in that class to have students use what they had written in the margins as the basis for other more formal writing assignments. And so I'm always amazed by what students are able to produce in the margins that really goes beyond, the kind of short paragraph model that I might expect from them, as a requirement. So my students say that they love it. Students, in response to my mid-semester course survey, ask for, more Hypothesis. I hope we'll keep doing this for the rest of the semester. I think most students online are familiar with the Canvas discussion groups, but there's just been such enthusiasm among my students for using Hypothesis. So I'm just super excited that I've been able to use it in my online teaching and also in person.
Thanks, Jamie. Lisa or Ryan, is there anything, any kind of tips that you might give a new user based on your experiences in using it over a couple semesters?
I think I heard this mentioned, but just to expand on that in addition to their interaction on, in Hypothesis, making their comments and commenting to each other, they really appreciate bringing it into the classroom. So tying it into, if they touched on a topic that wasn't necessarily part of my lecture plan, but, I do a little research, get a couple figures, put that in, to address that comment. If they have questions, what would happen if they considered this variable? I'll put that on the board and make that a group activity. And in the few class sessions where we've had student presentations and weren't able, to work with the annotations, there was feedback on that they wanted, they wanted that returned. They wanted to discuss their discussions in the classroom in some way, whether it was group activities or at one of Christie's suggestions this semester, I implemented go back through a meta-analysis. I have the students go back through their own annotations and identify themes. And they have a moment to bring up any last burning questions we didn't address. And so I think that just ties it right into the classroom. And they did voice that they wanted that.
Oh, great, Lisa. It sounds like the students are kind of really getting into the assignments. What about you, Ryan? Is there anything, as you've experimented with Hypothesis that you have found works better or worse that you would advise faculty who might be getting started?
Yeah, so a lot of what we've talked about so far is hypothesis offers you a kind of a carrot, right? Like something that students can engage with that they like and that they respond very well to. But I think it also offers a stick in the sense that, you know, you're giving people a lot of like source readings of text that they're not familiar with that are really high level. And a lot of students will try to skate through course without actually reading, you know, without doing the readings, or sometimes they don't do all the readings or they'll skim the readings. So one of the reasons I use hypothesis is to make sure that students are actually doing the readings and doing it on the timeline that you want them to do it. So if you want students to read something before they come to class, you know, you can you can play around with the timing, right? Like when are the annotations actually due? And this is a learning curve because, like, you know, I would try to do, oh, I want the annotations due before class. Students don't really like that. Maybe want a little bit more flexibility. Like, can it be due like, you know, I don't know, that week sometime so that we can talk about it in class before, and I'm still forming all my ideas. Okay, fine. But I think that what I don't want is to have it due after the entire week has already gone by, and then it's like too late for me to incorporate what they would comment into the class discussion anyways. So I think the timing is kind of important, and that's something maybe you have to experiment with depending on how you want to use it, what kind of course content you have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I often find myself, I know someone in the chat mentioned teaching asynchronous online courses. That's what I teach, and my students use Hypothesis in my asynchronous online course. And I often find that I wish I had like the face-to-face setting where we could kind of come back to the annotations and discuss those together. So I think that space can be really important, but the timing is tricky as well. So thanks for all those thoughts. Kind of more broadly, I think we've touched on some of these things before, but I'm wondering more broadly as well. Has using hypothesis and social annotation changed the way that you have taught at all? Has it impacted the way that you have kind of taught your classes? Any volunteers to take that one first? It's like a big picture question.
I would say yes, on the level of it really does allow you to take more of a seminar approach in a larger class, which I think is really cool. Because usually when you teach a larger class, I get all this advice from other people who have taught these classes. They say, look, make it as easy on yourself as possible. You know, you just do lecture, they take multiple choice exams and whatever. And that doesn't really get the kind of engagement I think that you want. But when you incorporate something like this, where people are discussing papers with each other, it takes a little bit of the burden off of you, and then it gives them a forum to talk about stuff outside of the very limited class time that you have, so that you kind of get the best of both worlds. You can have some, you know, you have lecture, but then you can also have some almost seminar colloquium style discussion happening, even if it doesn't happen in the classroom. It's happening somewhere, and you get a similar kind of engagement. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. What about you, Lisa or Jamie? Has it changed the way that you're teaching your classes at all?
It made everything a little easier, or the things that I like to do in class a little easier. So no big change, but I was always the one to, and still am, you know, think of activities, think of small group think tank questions, think of something new and relevant, you know, to add to my, you know, lecture for that day. And now I have all the fodder I need for that just by going to their comments and seeing what their questions are and what their interests are. And then it just lends itself to all of those things. So not sure how much it's changed it, but it has made it easy, you know, at a click and just browsing through, I can, you know, easily come up with that day's activities.
No, that's great. What about you, Jamie?
Yeah, I would just add that Hypothesis has really transformed my online teaching because it has created, you know, this kind of connective tissue between the different parts of a Canvas module. So, you know, rather than having students watch a video lecture, do a reading, you know, perhaps look at another type of source and then write a kind of discussion post in the discussion forum at the end, synthesizing it, which we still do sometimes in my online courses. But Hypothesis, I think, gives them a way to more sort of immediately synthesize what they have been engaging with in terms of the course content. And I think having the reading there, they're looking at it while they're annotating, having it in the margins, I think does create that kind of immediacy that you might not get, in a later reflection in the discussion post. And I also think that students perceive it as a more sort of casual conversational space, perhaps lower stakes than a Canvas discussion post, which feels more formal, right? Like a sort of small section of an essay. And so I do think the social aspect of it has been tremendously important, especially for building a sense of intellectual community in an online class. And students, I think, have done a marvelous job of using the annotation as a way to also draw connections to other themes and other topics in the course. So it's a kind of connective tissue there as well, connecting one module to the next and to the next. So in that way, I see it as perhaps a little more flexible and even maybe intellectually more dynamic than the Canvas discussion forums. And I know that folks teaching online have had great success with the Canvas discussion forums as well, but I have just personally found Hypothesis a little bit easier to use in helping me achieve my goals for the course.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, I've had the same experience with students kind of seeing the Hypothesis annotations to be like a more casual space to have a discussion rather than the Canvas discussions always seem like a bit more formal, and I'm directing them more so as far as like what types of questions they're answering. Whereas in Hypothesis, there's a little bit more space for them to make other kinds of connections as well. So I definitely have seen a lot of the things you've been talking about. There's been a couple of people in the chat who have brought up the idea of grading in annotations and also the time commitment related to grading annotations, especially in a class that has a lot of students. So do you mind explaining if you grade annotations and if you do, how you grade them? Ryan, do you mind answering this one first, since you mentioned having like at least 100 students annotating in your class?
Yeah, I grade annotations. I give them completion grade. So it's, did you do it? Did you make a comment? Did you ask a question? Did you contribute meaningfully? If you do, you get points. If you don't do it, then you don't get the points. And that's the easiest way to take pressure off grading. You just look for, did they do it or not? And then you can spend your time actually answering their questions and like adding to the commentary, rather than just spending time thinking about how much is this worth. And the more important thing is just like, are they actually doing the readings?
Yeah, that's a good point. What about you, Jamie?
Yeah, I definitely use the complete incomplete for my larger online courses, both for, myself and my teaching assistant in terms of our workload. In my smaller, my in-person class has smaller sections. And so there I will grade them more substantively, but we don't do them as frequently. So we might do one a week as opposed to, perhaps two a week in a larger online course. So, I think for anyone using it, as Ryan said, it's just sort of a choice about where to spend your time and energy. And so sometimes I will grade complete, incomplete. And sometimes I will grade, by percentage or points. And so I've found that sort of not letting students know which it will be, inspires them to always, do their best work in their annotations.
Yeah, so mixing it up yet again with the grading, with the instructions and with the grading. Lisa, how do you tend to grade in your?
Reminds me in psychology of like intermittent reward
Oh, yeah.
schedules. We know it works.
Yeah,
got to keep them on their toes, right?
And I also work with the completion grading model, but I will, if I notice, when I notice somebody just said, why is this? Or what's that? I will comment and say, next week, I will be looking for you to make a more substantial comment. For example, your comment today could have been, embellished to be, such and such. So I will give them the one warning, I'll be looking for you next week. And I let them know an example of how they could have made their current comment more substantial. And that has worked 90% of the time.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I also do a complete incomplete grade in my own courses. I don't have a large course. My course is about 25 students. So, but I do complete incomplete, and then I will also kind of nudge students if they're adding annotations that are like not really adding to the conversation in a meaningful way, kind of nudge like where you could have extended on that a little bit, and that has tended to help. Yeah, so it sounds like we're all kind of on a similar same page. And I think that Jamie and Ryan also kind of mentioned this. When I work with instructors and they're talking about grading, to me, it always comes down to like, what is your purpose for having the students annotate? How frequently are they going to be annotating? That's really going to be driving how you want to assess their annotations. If it's like a really important article that they're annotating as they prep for a major research paper that they're doing or something, perhaps that grading should be more involved than, a reading they're reading before class. So I think purpose is an important thing to keep in mind, as well as your own goals in using hypothesis annotation as well. So first off, I'm gonna continue asking some questions, but I also want to open it up to the chat. If anyone that's here would like to ask the panelists questions, if you could type those into the chat, I can field those in our last few minutes to Jamie, Ryan, and Lisa. But otherwise, I will move on to the questions that I have here. So do you feel that social annotation has helped build community in your course in any way, or what has kind of surprised you about using social annotation? Lisa, can you start us off with that one?
Yes, well, absolutely during any remote teaching, and I would imagine this applies to online teaching. The students reported that any chance to interact with each other was very much valued by themselves and by me as well. So that was tremendous. And even now, with I still do this for in-person classes. I see clusters kind of forming in the class discussion that look a lot like the comment threads that I see. So the students who tend to, kind of comment from a cultural psychology, I'm in the psychology department, so they'll, some will comment from a cultural psychology, kind of viewpoint or developmental. And, I see those same pockets of conversation forming in the classroom. And I think, again, what has surprised me is just how much the students have taken to this, and how most of the time really, lend something to the conversation in their comments. I was very worried, especially just with a completion grade, with several readings a week, that there would just be a lot of, what is this, comments, and there really aren't. And then when the students go and do their own research and bring it back to the conversation, well, I found this article that said this. They amaze me. The students have amazed me with their use of hypothesis.
No, that sounds super exciting. What about you, Jamie?
Yeah, I think that students really have reveled in the social aspect of it. And many students will say that they really like to know what other people think about the reading. They love to post links or to post images or videos. And I mean, although you could do that in Canvas discussion forums, I think they just perceive it as a different kind of online space, perhaps because it is relatively so much newer compared to the discussion forums that they may have already been familiar with. But that sort of informal social engagement, and just the very fact of posting, I think it feels somehow qualitatively different to them than writing in the discussion forum, which I know Christie and others mentioned before. I did experiment with an idea that I saw on one of the hypothesis blogs, which was to assign an essay that used annotations as the basis for the assignment. So I tried this in my upper level writing course, and students all annotated a particular reading together and then had to go back and choose 2 classmates' annotations to then use as the springboard for their final essay. And so I was a little unsure of how this experiment would turn out, but I thought it was very much worthwhile. Students really enjoyed it. It seemed to them something quite different, you know, from a standard academic essay. And so I'm just interested in, you know, finding out more ways to experiment with it in the semesters to come.
Ooh, that sounds like a super interesting assignment. I need to think of a way to incorporate that into my own class. What about you, Ryan?
Yeah, so I think you guys have already said like a lot of interesting stuff about how, you know, how this works in practice. I think another thing about using hypothesis, like you say, Jamie says, it feels different, right? It feels different for students than using the discussion board. Something I've noticed when I was using discussion boards early on in the pandemic before I found out about hypothesis. And I think that hypothesis makes the discussions more grounded because they're anchored to the reading. So sometimes discussion posts just like they wind up going way out in left field, people talking to each other. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's like, I do want to rein people in a little bit, make sure they're talking about the thing they're actually supposed to be talking about. I think hypothesis helps because it's like the text is right there. Everyone can see it and they can see what you're talking about. The other thing I've noticed in terms of it being highly social is I do see people doing similar things on hypothesis that they used to do in the discussion forums, where they'll refer to each other by name and they'll say like, oh, that was a really interesting thought. You know, here's what I think about that. And they draw in a lot of their personal experience. So I'm doing a lot of stuff about language, and almost everyone at Rutgers is multilingual. They come from multilingual backgrounds. So everyone has some kind of experience they can share in the annotations, and then they talk to each other in that way. And sometimes it does it, you know, it comes back in class and then we'll bring it up again and say, oh yeah, that reminds me, I wrote this on hypothesis. This is some relevant experience and that someone else shared with me. And that kind of thing is really cool.
Yes, that does sound really cool, having the students bring in, you know, their own experiences. I also find that in my gender and technology class, it's like everyone has experiences with gender and technology, right? So the students always have stories to tell in the annotations, and I find that they're often, you know, co-contributors to the knowledge of the course. I know we are running low on time, and that's why Eric has kind of reappeared in the corner. So I just want to thank Lisa, Jamie, and Ryan for taking the time out today to talk to us about how they're using hypothesis. All right, well, thanks again, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much again to our panelists for taking time out of their spring break to talk about hypothesis. And please, I put my my email into the chat. If you want to email me with questions, I am always happy to help. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
All right. Thank you very much and take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Take
for
care.
having me.